بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope everybody's well. Welcome to today's discourse. I did say last week uh, that this particular discourse about narcissism, but my health wasn't too well last week, so I couldn't deliver last week's discourse properly. So what I'm going to do is, inshallah, next week, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be covering part of that discourse again, and with the additional discussion on narcissism, hopefully from next week and the week after. I wanted to break it up a little bit today. I've talked about a lot of critical topics in the sense that topics that are related to critiquing certain areas of thought and understanding and kind of looking for solutions for them. So today I wanted to break it up with a more, I wouldn't say general, but kind of spiritually rooted topic in a sense. A topic that is more, you could say, kind of devotional. That's probably the best way to put it. So today's topic, which is with the one I love, is a part of a longer seminar that I used to deliver. And I'm going to look at certain parts of it today, or a certain element of it. But I just want to introduce the topic, like I normally do on the discourses. And that is that to say that this particular topic is related to the rights due to the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. But I want to introduce the kind of the angle that I want to take today, and that is to not reassess, but to kind of reflect over our relationship with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is that? What it should be, what it currently is, and what it should be. And also looking at it from a perspective that is as much, that is more than just the kind of devotional idea, adding to an element of self-benefit that I often feel that we lose in having an unbalanced relationship. So inshallah, I want to talk about those things. So to begin with, I want to talk about this idea of rights, what rights are. Now, rights, of course, are in our, religiously speaking, Islam anyway, we hold rights as something very important, what we call hukuk. And unfortunately, human beings, especially now considering we've moved, there's a kind of paradigm shift to a selfish, from a selfless paradigm to a selfish paradigm, where now we opt for everything about the self, about the ego. And we've given up the idea that being selfless is something that we're here for, especially with the kind of culture we have now. The TikTok, Instagram type of culture where it's all centered around a person kind of advertising themselves or popularizing themselves. And that essentially is the culture. If you look at TikTok, for instance, it's that essentially is the culture itself, where everybody's on there to make a name for themselves. But again, it's a paradigm shift. The idea of now we've become almost entirely a selfish culture, and left the idea of a selfless culture where the person, we ourselves, our egos are not important. Rather, we're here to benefit and assist other people's lives. And if we all did it at a communal level, then everybody will be assisted and helped. So rights are very important in Islam. So there are rights that the earth has over us, for instance, rights that the animals have over us, and of course rights that people have. And on the Day of Judgment, of course, rights are the most important underlining factor of one's salvation. Rights are, if one fulfills their rights on the earth correctly, then the path on resurrection is easy, simply because our questioning is weighty on the right side then, or the scales are weighty on the right side than the left. So on that note, who the greatest of those to whom rights are owed, for us as human beings, of course, we would assume it are the parents and people who have a right over us because of some type of kind of some form of from a perspective that we owe them something, that they've done a great good for us or gone through a great struggle for us. Therefore, they have a particular right over us, which is absolutely true. There's a dimension of that. But essentially, from all human beings, the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam has the greatest right over us, and simply because he is the Messenger of God alayhi salat, through him did we receive belief, did we receive the message, did we receive the access to God, to the divine, did we receive this divine knowledge, revelation, and did we receive proper conduct and character. And it is through that, or through him, that we become better people, essentially. There are certain things, of course, that all human beings do, and we can pick up naturally within us this kind of natural disposition, and we incline towards certain things that are good. But the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam anchors us in not only in excellent character, but in gives us access to divine knowledge. However, there's another element of him, of course, alayhi salatu wasalam, which is the person of the Prophet, which is incredibly important, that due to a rise in that was forgotten for a certain period of time, maybe over the last 100 odd years in certain parts of the world, among certain people, that is that the Messenger of God as a person, our relationship with him as a as one that we love as a person, not that we love his sunnah, therefore we love his practice, therefore, but we love him as a person, that we anchor our practice in him alayhi salatu, and that relationship with him. That, of course, was kind of almost systematically, I would say systematically ignored, or you could say there was a intended effort to subdue that dimension or that paradigm. And from around the mid 1800s all the way up to now, when kind of the general Najdi movement is now pretty much on its last legs. It's over due to kind of lack of political and political support from the Middle East, and that madhab now is just kind of deteriorating and disappearing. And oft is when a group of people are popularized or become famous when they're assisted by governance and power and money, much like the Mu'tazili school. When that money runs out, or that help on the high level runs out, then of course it begins to dwindle, and those evidences that were so strong once for many people are not very strong anymore, and that weight is not really behind them to kind of push out and popularize that school. And that is, like I said, it's this idea of having a deep connection or relationship with the person of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, of course, belief in the Prophet, when we begin this idea that we believe in him, that we believe he, of course, existed, as the first point. And the reason I bring that up now, because I believe in the next 100 years or 200 years, Western academics or critics of Islam will even begin to cast doubts around, did he even exist? Was there a person that name, just as they've done with Jesus Christ, like Richard Dawkins, for instance, although he's not any theologian, and his general writing when it comes to theology is incredibly poor. Even tries to argue that, there's even some historical dispute over the fact that Jesus existed or not, alayhi salam. But of course, he was very embarrassing for him when he was asked about it, when there's complete unanimity amongst historians that he existed. But that will be a case in a few hundred years about the Prophet ﷺ, I believe, because that's just the kind of way of revisionist history that we're headed towards. Of course, we believe in the Messenger of God. To believe in him, we believe that not only he existed, but he was a prophet of God, that he received divine revelation, that the angel came to him and gave him this great knowledge of the unseen, and that then he spread that knowledge amongst the people. And also the way that his character has been narrated to us, that his person has been narrated to us, alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, our entire faith, of course, therefore, is anchored in belief in him, in the sense that we only know God through the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu. Of course, rationally, we could look at the signs in the world, and there are certain things that are fitra, kind of points to immediately, Allah states in the Quran that do they not reflect over what's in themselves. So there's this idea that the fitrah, the kind of natural disposition of a human being, will also always kind of wonder about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wonder about this creator. But the Prophet ﷺ is the one that, through him did we find God, in that sense. Now, the idea of obedience. Now, what does obedience mean? I want to just kind of unpack this idea of obedience. What is obedience? We often hear this word about being obeying, and unfortunately, it's misused. Especially, it's especially misused in within the marital paradigm. Oh, my wife has to obey me, and kind of obedience to the husband. And it is really odd that we only have obedience is only one-sided in a marital relationship. But I really don't like this translation when it comes to this idea of using this word obedience in a marital relationship. That's not how marriage works. Marriage is not a kind of a government relationship where you have to kind of so it's not a kind of draconian legal system, marriage. And that type of language not only is bad for the relationship, but it's also just a bad way of looking at marriage itself and relationship between men and women. This idea of very kind of draconian, not even draconian, but a very hierarchical kind of idea where the husband is at the top and the wife is just below, and she has to do everything he says. The reality is both the husband and the wife have to obey God. That's the reality of it. It's nothing more than that. And then there's something called rights. It's not obedience, it's rights. The wife has rights over the husband, and the husband has rights over the wife. And as long as rights are fulfilled, then the marriage is fine in that sense. And when rights are not fulfilled, that's when you have problems. But this word obedience is not really the correct word to use in that context. And maybe there'll be an outcry now saying, "Oh, how dare you say that?" Well, that's probably because maybe you're one of those men. You probably sort yourself out. So in terms of the Quran, Allah states in the Quran that Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum, obey God and obey the messenger and those in power amongst you. Normally that's used for leaders, although it kind of extends as well. More than that. And then Allah states in the Quran about obeying the messenger of God in the sense of following as well. We have that idea. And we have the famous narration that whatever I bring, take, and whatever I leave as much. Whatever I bring, do as much as you can. Whatever I leave. So we have many verses and ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talk about this idea of obedience. Now, number one, obedience of the messenger of God is, of course, an extension of obedience to Allah. But what does it mean to obey the messenger of God? And I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. We have, I would suggest, an imbalance anyway, in terms of how we have an imbalance in regard to our relationship with the messenger of God. I'm talking about the common idea amongst traditional Muslims, and by traditional I mean kind of orthodox belief from people from Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and not even if they're from the overly spiritual dimension, but even from amongst the fuqaha, etc. The people that normally adhere to our madhab, our way, we have a part of our belief that gives great reverence to the Prophet ﷺ, and that's a part of our obligation. However, there's often misunderstandings within that paradigm. And so we have this idea that it's enough among some people, it's a type of jahal, almost ignorance, that it's enough to get together here and there and sing in praise of the Prophet ﷺ and then finish off and everybody eats and then we close the door and we get on with our lives as normal. And therefore the messenger of God is only talked about, or not only talked about, I would say, but only part of our lives in that regard. That, of course, is not only an innovation, but it's a great injustice, and it's not fulfilling this right that I'm talking about. Why? Because the messenger of God is not somebody that in our lives plays a part when we meet up at specific times to remember, and then we just leave the topic altogether. And also, it's a false type of love as well, or claim to love. The Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, the purpose that he serves in our lives extends to every part of our lives, or it should extend to every part of our lives. Considering he was al-insanul kamil, the perfect man, or the perfect human, he is also the perfect guide. He's also the perfect mercy. He's also the perfect teacher. He's also, alayhi salatu wasalam, the perfect mentor. He, alayhi salatu wasalam, is everything that you can think of, the perfect of. He's a perfection of that. So therefore, it wouldn't make any sense to come together and just praise him and then things go back to normal and the Messenger of God is not part of our lives. And those who say, but that doesn't, well, it does happen. Those who say it doesn't, it does. I've witnessed it not only often, but others would have witnessed it as well, that people's relationships with the Prophet are not just circumstantial, but they're very kind of surface level. That's the probably better way to put it. Now, of course, praising the Prophet ﷺ is a wonderful thing, but it has to go with an idea of more. There has to be more than that. What I mean by that is, why does God send prophets? That's the first question. God sends prophets to guide people as a huda. Why? Because people are misguided, and prophets come in to or kind of are amongst the people anyway, or they remind them of their duty to man and to God, and they reform people's character. Very interestingly, if you've read the Analects of Confucius, they say about Confucius that although nobody says he's a prophet, but some researchers have suggested he was a monotheist. That they said, what did Confucius come for? And they said Confucius came to talk about what he called the reality. You could infer that he was talking about God, and to correct people's character. And very interestingly, that's in line with this idea of what prophets come to bring, although I'm not suggesting he was a prophet. But this idea that all spiritualists or people of spirituality have always understood this idea of that the greatest people are the ones who reform others' character, and the greatest people for us are Ulul Azm, especially the higher branch of prophets, are the greatest people for us, and the Prophet ﷺ is the greatest of all mankind that God ever sent. So if he comes, alayhi salatu, to correct people's character, when he said famously, I did not come except to correct correct one's character, then if our character is not being corrected, then there's something seriously wrong in the way our relationship works with the Prophet ﷺ. So we call this idea the sunnah, the pathway, or his way, alayhi salatu wasalam. The Prophet ﷺ said, Man ragiba an sunnati falaysa minni, one who does not desire my sunnah or moves away from my sunnah is not from me, meaning is not part of me or my way. And in many ahadith, he talks about following. For instance, marriage is one of the most emphasized sunnahs. I don't bring marriage up specifically, but and he said, "An-nikahu min sunnati, faman raghiba an sunnati falaysa minni." Nikah is from my sunnah. And he dua for all the people who are unmarried, and Allah give you good spouses. He's not from me, and it was just to emphasize that kind of people are completed by being part of a good relationship. So we're missing this idea of the sunnah. Now, the sunnah, of course, I haven't done a discourse on this, but I did previously do a lecture on this. Often it's easy to highlight the things that are jabilli, the things that the Prophet ﷺ normally did day to day, the way he dressed or the way he did his hair and things like that. And people, they're easy to follow. But the actual sunnahs, if you look at them, that he emphasized constantly are mostly related to character. They're the hard ones, and they're ones that we often forego or don't really fulfill because of their difficulty, but yet they're the main ones. We don't want to be from those people on the Day of Judgment who come near the Prophet ﷺ on the Day of Judgment. He calls us to him, and then they'll be pushed away by the angels in the Hadith of Sahih Muslim. And the Prophet ﷺ says, why do you turn them away? And he said, you don't know what they left after you. Some say that this is to do with believers who left the sunnah. And he says, suhkan. Others say that these are people who reneged their contract with the Prophet, in the time of Abu Bakr, the people that refused to pay zakat. but others say it extends to people who leave the sunnah. But anyway, my point is that the sunnah is incredibly important as a sign of his love. Like I said, not in the dress and those elements. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the character. We're talking about how one behaves. Is our behavior anchored in the idea that I'm behaving in this way because this is how the Prophet taught me to behave? And that's quite difficult to do. And it's not only difficult to do, but why is it that we don't kind of try to inculcate those things every day? It's not, the color of our shoes, or if we're wearing an izar or a qamis. It's nothing to do with that, of course. Those are things that are done out of love of the Prophet ﷺ, and many people have done them out of loving the Messenger of God, and in that there's a great good as well. But the sunnah, in the context of which the fuqaha mentioned and people normally understand, and the Prophet ﷺ emphasized, was heavily to do with character and the way that we behave. And in all honesty, our behavior is not anchored in the way that the Prophet ﷺ taught us. We have so many spiritual diseases that it will be difficult to put them down in a book, leave alone, for a few papers. And yet we don't think of working on them. We don't think, the way we behave with people, is it anchored in the sunnah? Is it something that the Prophet ﷺ taught us? Are we fulfilling that contract of love? Remember, there are contracts are we fulfilling that contract of love with the Prophet ﷺ? And it's very, and we haven't been doing it. And unfortunately, we don't even have a drive to do it. And then we assume that on the Day of Judgment we'll be from the muqarrabin, from those people who are close to the Messenger of God. And unfortunately, it's not looking good if our character is not up to scratch. Now I want to move to loving, and what love is, and loving the Prophet ﷺ, because it's a claim, isn't it? Allah says, if your wives or children are dearer to you than Allah and His Messenger, then wait till the command of Allah comes. And this verse indicates obligation to love the Prophet ﷺ more than anything else. Though love cannot be forced, it indicates what is expected from a sound heart. If this is not the case, one needs to question why not. And this is a verse of Quran about loving the Messenger of God. There are many hadith on this central issue. The famous hadith, none of you truly loves until you love me more than yourself, your parents, your children, and all of mankind. Hadith of Umar radiallahu ta'ala an. So there's that narration. And at the end of it, Sayyidina Umar says, I love you more than anything. Sa'ad al-Tustari said, whoever does not think that the Prophet ﷺ is his master in all states, or think that he's under the dominion of the Prophet, ﷺ, will not taste the sweetness of true faith. And of course, that is true. That love, there's a story about Majnun, Qais ibn Mulawih. Majnun, for those who don't know, I'm sure you do know, is a famous person from the Tabi'een, actually, from the early Muslims. He's a real person. He's not a made-up person. He's not a fictional character. That is in love with Layla, and Nizam wrote a famous Persian kind of not biography, but story about him. You can even get it in English. There's a translation of it, which is quite fascinating. And he never married Layla, didn't end up getting married, but he wrote a lot of poetry about her. And anyway, there's a story of one of the scholars writes about a dream that he has. And in this dream, he's on the Day of Judgment, and God, Allah states in the Quran that, the angels, they line up in ranks, and then people are, brought out. And anyway, there comes Majnun. The case comes in chained, brought in front of God. And God says to Qais, what's your crime like? Yeah. And it's announced that his crime was that he loved Layla more than anything else. I don't know if it's a crime, but that's what's said. And then God says in this story that, or the angels say that, bring out all the people that claim to love me, because he's admitted that that's my crime and I admit to it. And let's bring out all the people who claim to love me. And let's see if it measures with the love that Layla, Majnun or Qais had for Layla. And if it does not, then throw them into hell. The Burmese almost has a measure on the Day of Judgment for those. And of course, those people didn't love God. It was just claimed تأسي إله وأنت تثر حبه هذا محال في الفعل بديع لأن حبك صادق لعطاءته إن المحب لمن يحب مطيع. Like the famous poet talks about false love. And so love is a claim, of course, but it's not. It's very difficult to prove unless it's through practice and true annihilation, you could say, in the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu, in that regard. But love is there. I mean, you see in many hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, clearly the Sahaba understood that loving him wasn't just, oh, I'm following the Sunnah, of course, a very important central element. But it was the other element that I mentioned at the beginning. But there was a balance, of course, a fine balance. That love had an external manifestation. And love generally does, doesn't it? I mean, when people love, when a person's in love, it has an external manifestation, whether they like it or even if they try to hide it as much as they try to hide it, it still is evident on their faces, in their actions, in the way they talk, in their silence even. And a lot is said in a lover's silence. It's there, at least in reflection or thinking about it, it's there. And of course, we can only pray to God that we get even an iota of that form of love that the early people had for the Prophet ﷺ. I remember once, just to tell you a little story. I was somewhere and it was a little conference. I probably regret going there. But somebody stood up and said, oh, loving the Prophet has two dimensions. I was already worried what this person's going to say next, but I was worried what he was going to say to begin with. But he said, there's an element of love and the element of hate. Oh. Anyway, he went on to say something just completely ridiculous, but there is no hate in love. Love is just love. That sounds circular, but love is something that only lovers know what it feels like. It's something that's hissy, something that's sensory, that somebody feels. In terms of hate, of course, how can hate be part of it? Hate can be a reaction to something else, but in terms of that love, hate is not mixed with that. Now, the love of the early those in my community with the greatest love for me are those who will come after. There's a famous hadith of the Prophet of the lovers. And in fact, it's called the hadith of the brothers, that he, of course, nobody would ever dare claim that one is the brother of the Prophet. What a hideous way to speak about the Prophet for us. In fact, if anything, the Prophet is our spiritual father in the famous kind of a variant reading Abun Lakum of that verse in the Quran, edition of the Mus'haf of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. But in this hadith, the Messenger of God mentions it in an idea of kind of inferring a closeness, taqarrub. That's why he used the word brothers that come. And they said, are we not your brothers? The Sahaba, and said, the companion. He said, no, you're my companions. And he said, these are people who come at the end of time or close to the end of time, that if they were given an option to give up everything, their families, and they would do so if only to see me once or to meet me. And that, of course, this is such a rare form of love, but it's for the people that come at the end. And it gives some hope as well, and some solace that we can have a rank with the Prophet ﷺ, even though we didn't see him. And one of the great miracles, of course, of the Prophet ﷺ is the fact that we are sitting here 1400 years later talking about loving him, loving somebody we've never met, we've never seen in person. We have never been able to smell his scent. We've never been able to feel his warmth, his physical warmth, hear his words, be in his company where that spiritual energy surrounds us. We've never been in his company so he can comfort us in our difficult times. Yet we still kind of feel elements of that 1400 years later, sitting here when we just talk about him as if we were sitting in the company of the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, and almost for the lovers anyway, it seems that life is not short enough, being that they want to be with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and be in that presence, be in his presence, be with him. And yeah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged also his love. Whenever a woman made hijrah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would make her swear that she had come only for Allah and his messenger. This idea that people only made hijrah for God and his messenger, meaning it's only for the love of God and the love of the messenger of God that you've done it, not for anything worldly. So there's this idea that I've done this for the sake of loving the messenger of God, the investment of the emotional investment in him, alayhi salatu wasalam, that we ought to make, at least. Now, the signs of love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, let's talk about some of those. Number one, following his sunnah. Of course, Allah states in the Quran, "In kuntum tuhibbuna Allah fattabi'uni yuhibbukum Allah." Allah says, if you love Allah, then follow me. He told the Messenger of God to tell us, his followers, that if you truly love Allah, then follow me. Then Allah will love you and forgive your sins. So one of the signs of love is ittiba, this following of the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. Number two, preferring his rulings over one's wishes, that we prefer what the Messenger of God gave to us over our own wants and desires. By your Lord, Allah states in the Quran, they do not believe until they find no dislike in what you rule. And these are a combination of two verses. That we can never dislike that which the Messenger of God wanted for us, clearly. We can never dislike that which he wanted for us, that's that which he guided us towards, that we place that above anything that we desire in the world. And this is something quite important for the believer, that a general principle. And the general principle is that anything that God mentions in his book, commands us to, is inevitably good for us. It's in and of itself, it's understood to be something good for us, whether we know that or not. Why would God command us to do something except it's only good for us, considering that our general belief, of course, is that God does not do something to benefit himself, as God is the infinite, the transcendent essence that doesn't benefit, doesn't change. La yataghayyar. So why would God benefit from that? Or God does not benefit, rather. And only humans benefit from that which God commands us towards. So this idea, it's almost a level of arrogance within the human being, this type of kibr that we have, that we don't want to admit it, but it's almost, we're trying to say we know better. But yet God is only doing it for our own good. And an element of that can be understood in a parent-child relationship. Not all the time, of course, some parents are bullies, and they bully their children. It's unfortunate for us to admit that as parents, but it's our nafs and our ego more than it is anything else, or our trauma. But generally speaking, a parent often wants good for their children. And the child may not understand that, considering their lack of knowledge or age. And so in that moment, what would the parent want except good for their child? But the child doesn't understand that. So only goes according to their own kind of knowledge that they have at that particular time, and then they grow, and then they learn later when they become parents often. That's number two. Number two was preferring his rulings over one's wishes. Number three, your anger is only for the sake of Allah. I want to unpack this a little, this idea of sake of. So number one, God doesn't need our anger or our good deeds or anything like that. So when we say, I hear this often. In fact, this is a common thing in Islam. Amongst Muslims, we find, I only love you. I love you for the sake of Allah. This needs a whole discourse, by the way. It's so irritating that I only have this is not the topic today, and I don't have time to kind of unpack it. When we say to people, first of all, we shouldn't say that I love you for the sake of Allah, because most people that say that do not even know what they're saying. They haven't thought about that statement. What does that statement actually mean? I only love you for the sake of Allah. It seems as if you're saying, I wouldn't normally love you. I wouldn't be inclined to loving you, but I'm loving you because God somewhere in the Quran in a verse said that I should love the believers. So, just because I want to fulfill that statement, I'm just going to go with it. That's what it sounds like you're saying, because you've never thought about what you're actually saying, or how that idea lillah has been mistranslated into English as for the sake of God. It's a complete mistranslation and misinterpretation of doing something for God. And this idea that these two things are somehow mutually exclusive, and that and it's a very clunky way of saying something. No, we love people because we love them. Innately, we have this idea of love within us, and where the idea of affection is triggered almost, or innate with this idea, deep idea of love is the idea that we're connected to that person, or we want to do something for their sake. For us to say, no, we're doing this because it's for the sake of God. Stop invoking God in that sense. This is just a misunderstanding of, that needs to be unpacked. I'll dedicate some time to that in the future, inshallah, to give all the statements that have been used in Arabic, how they're mistranslated into English. When you say to your mother, I love you, you don't say, mother, I love you for the sake of God. What does that mean? 3-4 second silence for that. No, you love your parents because you have this deep sense of connection to them. We love the Prophet ﷺ because we have a deep sense of connection with the Messenger of God. So when we're angry and we say we only get angry for the sake of God, what that actually means is, to unpack that, it means that often we become angry due to our ego, due to our own ego, or our own kind of sense of entitlement, or our own benefit. That we're angry because we feel, wrongly of course, that we deserve a particular right to be fulfilled. If it's due to that, then we shouldn't be angry for that. Rather, we should be angry by kind of what God has outlined in relation to kind of the parameters of what deserves anger. You could put it that way. And when we assess that, we clearly realize that they're not ego-based ideas. They're not egocentric ideas. That the idea of anger should be for that which benefits others often. And also we can be angry for ourselves, of course, when our rights are not fulfilled. Naturally, you would be angry about something. But this idea that it shouldn't be egocentric. It shouldn't be something that is just anchored in ego and anchored in kind of this idea of entitlement. That's what it actually means. Number 4, frequent remembrance and yearning to meet him. This is the most difficult, of course, because our lives are packed full, all of us, myself, so all of us are fulfilled with kind of these micro events that take place, these constant distractions, whether they be necessary distractions or self-inflicted distractions, but we're constantly involved in that type of life. So it's difficult to remember the Messenger of God sometimes. However, we should think about the Messenger of God, during the day sometime at least, if that's just before or after within prayer, because there's a part of prayer dedicated to him. Or we should dedicate a portion of our day or week even to, and I mentioned that at the end, inshallah, to remembering him and talking about him, learning about him, maybe about the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. So further, the signs of love. So to exalt his mention and name, the way we speak about him. Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. You can tell a lover when he speaks about the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the language that he employs, the care that he takes to mention him, the care that he takes to present him, that the Messenger of God is not just, and you can tell about somebody's tarbiyah as a child and how they grew up and the teachers that they had in the way that they speak about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You can tell very, very quickly, because you can tell very quickly. Let's leave it at that. To love his family and his companions, of course, his family hold a high rank. I'm going to get to that, inshallah. To have dislike for those who dislike them. To have love for the Quran, to have compassion for his community, to prefer poverty over wealth, in the sense of being content with poverty if it's qadrullah maqdura. The reward for loving him is of course great. So I want to talk about, and there are many hadith that talk about his loving the Messenger of God and what the reward would be for that. You have the famous hadith of Al-Mar'u ma'a man ahab, the Sahabi who came to the Prophet saying, we're worried about who we will be with on the Day of Judgment. And he said, Al-Mar'u ma'a man ahab, one is with the one that he loves. And they, Mu'adh bin Jabal, and the narration of Anas ibn Malik, that they celebrated that day and they danced, and or rather they were ecstatic about that, because they knew that they loved the Prophet and they knew. And in fact, say that Aisha's hadith as well, she said, will one be with their beloved on the Day of Judgment? And he said, you will be, except in three places. And the three places were when your book is given to you, when the accounting, the mizan takes place, or when you cross the bridge. In these three, it's between you and God. Now I want to move on to the reality of love. Love is what is love itself? Love is the inclining of the heart towards something, and the way of how that love takes place for the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam. Number one, perception of outward beauty. So that's definitely there, because of course often some people's love is in the world. I'm talking about here, separate the idea, is surface level jamal. We see things, we love them, we see people, we fall in love with them because of the way they look. And that's something natural to every human being, and there's nothing wrong with that. The fact that we naturally inclined towards external beauty, there's nothing absolutely wrong with that. And that for human beings, by the way, for the opposite gender, when we see, that's not something that's necessarily sexual. It doesn't have to be like that. And this is a misunderstanding even amongst this idea that some people have presented men and women as like animals almost of each other, that every time they see each other. No, a beauty can be recognized by men and women in each other externally when they glance upon each other, and in a respectful manner, without it being kind of sexual. This is something, I don't know, people reduced our existence to that. We can recognize beauty, and that's something that's within us without having to do that. Men in women and women in men. And we often do that, and it's not something that's sensual in any way or form. So we always recognize that. So we have to accept that human beings, we recognize external beauty, and it's part of our fitrah almost to recognize external beauty. Therefore, prophets are sent as being the most handsome. The Prophet said, no prophet has been sent except he's handsome of face, and I am the most handsome of face. Meaning my beauty is the greatest of all people sent. And the Prophet was immensely beautiful, handsome. And many hadith are full of this idea of the beauty of the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam. His physical, I'm talking when you glance upon him, this physical beauty that you can see that is clear to everybody that sees him. So one needs to be, of course, that there's a perception in that, in that where the heart kind of draws towards that. Then there's the inward perfection. The inward perfection is more permanent in everything I'm talking about, long-lasting and more perfect. Why? Because essentially we are soul before body. So therefore, that element of beauty is more long-lasting, and not only more long-lasting. I'm talking generally, but there's the connection of souls. That beauty lasts longer in terms of love than anything else. So there's an inward perfection there. When it comes to the Prophet, of course, both elements are there, but that inward perfection is something that really anchors us in our love with him. The third, and this was the important thing that I mentioned right at the beginning, and I want to touch on this now, and I want to spend a bit of time on this, is recognition of benefit. That every blessing that we have received through him, alayhi salatu wasalam. And this is where this is the part of our relationship that's the most important, of the benefit, the nafa, daim, this kind of constant benefit that we draw from the Prophet ﷺ, this bahar, the ocean that he is, alayhi salatu wasalam, that we're drawing from the ocean constantly and benefiting our lives. And if we're not benefiting our lives, it's our fault that we're not taking from this prophetic ocean. That is to say that we're not taking from him, alayhi salatu wasalam, correctly. And this is one thing that I remember once I went. Somebody invited me there was a gathering, and I'm normally too busy to attend stuff because of classes and things like that. But I attended, and they said, oh, can you speak about the khasa'is, the miracles, or the special qualities, of the Prophet ﷺ? And I didn't know how could I take that, and how could this message affect people's lives. That's what I wanted to do. Because what's important is not, see, if we sit here and just talk about the Prophet ﷺ, which is wonderful, but we also want it to reform something within our lives, that tomorrow or today, even later on today, we can change something. That's what's important. And that's when I was talking about the imbalance right at the beginning, that unfortunately, it's not the case anymore. It's not we hear something and immediately now, okay, something's got to change in our lives. We've got to go and change something. Not enough of that's done. And we forget this immense benefit that we could bring about in our lives if we followed the messenger of God correctly. And that would be a real sign, or a kind of a real I would say a real fulfillment of that covenant that we have of the Prophet ﷺ, to show him, alayhi salatu wasalam, considering the hadith states that our actions are presented to him every day, that we have taken what the Messenger of God left us, and we've taken it, and now we're changing these little things, our relationships with people, with our family members, with our friends, and we're being better to people because we're taking that from the Hadi Nabawi. We're taking that from the prophetic guidance that he left us and gift. And the Prophet ﷺ, for him to be happy with us in that regard. And I think that's where the imbalance is often, that there's a lot of praise in word, but very little in action. There's very little to show for it, let's put it that way. And unfortunately, it's got out of control now. In Rabi', we see now that it's just lost its essence often. And I don't want to have a moan about that because I want to keep it positive. So this element of how is the messenger of God in our lives? What place is his way? Is his real love that we're claiming affecting our day-to-day life? Day-to-day, by I mean not just day-to-day, but action to action. Is he really, are we really being impacted by his words, and is it reforming us in that regard? I want to finish on a few points, inshallah. And that is one of the things that Imam Abdul Wahhab Sha'rani, the great saint and scholarly saint figure in our tradition, talked about. One of the things that in his time, and the lack of spiritual leaders, people to reform others, that he said one of the most important things is salawat, sending salawat upon the Prophet ﷺ, and to revive that tradition, but even at a very basic level, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 a day, just before going to sleep, as it's a element that connects us with the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, if we really want to know if we're connected to the Prophet ﷺ, we just need to look at one element, of course, but a very serious element. How much salawat are read every day? And if none are read, then our connection is very, very weak with the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. And then comes the Sunnah and the other elements. So this is something that I want to remind myself of, that I need to, and we need to, all of us collectively need to show a connection, show the Messenger of God that we do love him, and not only do we love him, but it's also on our tongues. That Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, and we inculcate that in our children as well. Inshallah, I'll take questions now on this topic. I hope that everybody benefit from that discourse, inshallah. can good actions be done with intention of pleasing the Prophet ﷺ, or can they only be sincere if done to Allah? For example, reading salawat, extra sunnah prayers. It's a very deep question, man. I'm going to need to think about that. Hamza, if you note that down, هذا بدو تفكر يعني. This is a question that needs a lot of thought before I answer that. I think I need to really think about it, because that is so multifaceted and deep, that question, that I need to really think about that. Inshallah, let me think about that properly before I give an answer for that. Are women allowed to stand in front of the Rawda and present their salam? Yeah. Let's see. Why would the Saudis not allow this, and what evidence do they use? I mean, unfortunately, I can't explain Saudi logic. Yeah. I don't know if that answer the question. I don't know, but yeah. What Sirah book would you recommend? I like Martin Lings. I think it's a really good book, excellent book actually. He has a few problems, like every book has problems. So maybe with G.F. Haddad's critique of it, but generally I think it was a brilliant book. You can get an audio version of it as well. If you don't like reading, then there's an audio version of it that's a shorter, more concise. I've listened to it as well. I thought it's brilliant. I think Sheikh Hamza has a. No, I know Sheikh Hamza. I've got it. I've got the OCD version of there. Has a whole. If you like listening rather than reading, then definitely I recommend Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's almost commentary, you could say, audio commentary of the Martin Lings book. It's excellent. I thought it was excellent. Other than those books, I think Sheikh Amjad has translated something. If somebody can put it on here, Hamza, you can put it on. It's translated, I think, Dr. Nuruddin Ittar's book. Or did Usman translate that? But it's published by Heritage Press. Or was it said Muhammad Ali al-Maliki's book? I have one here. I haven't really read through it. I've read it before. There's this book as well, which I find it's okay. Muhammad, the Best of Creation, Glimpse of His Blessed Life by Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ali al-Maliki. Sheikh Amjad translated. But this is very brief, actually. Martin Lings is an excellent book, like I said. Other books that I have about his life, alayhi salatu wassalam, in English. I mean, that's the one I can recommend anyway. So, are you allowed to address the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, as Sarkar, Kali Kamli Wale, etc.? Yeah, any honorific. Sheikh Booty is not Sirah. Sheikh Booty is a fiqh Sirah. Sheikh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Booty, rahimullah ta'ala's book is a fiqh Sirah. It's book more about the lessons from the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's not a typical Sirah. I read the English rendition of it. To be honest, it's a bit dry. I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't find it to be in English. In Arabic, it's very good. Arabic gives that a bit more. It's a very good work if you want to look at lessons from the Sirah. In those times, only 2 people wrote on that topic: Muhammad al-Ghazali, not Abu Hamid, Muhammad al-Ghazali and Azhari and Sheikh Booty. So it's a different type of book. Sorry, are you allowed to dress the Prophet as Sarkar? Of course, every language has its own honorifics for the Prophet ﷺ. Huzur, Sarkar. You know, these words are honorifics, and all honorifics are wonderful and beautiful to use them for the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, there's nothing. The mustahab, of course. Can repeating famous lines of poems from the Burda and others be counter salawat? Yes, of course. Salawat directly. Unless there's a command unless they're in the fashion of salawat, linguistically, then I would say that they wouldn't be counted as salawat. They'd be counted as madih. And madih is different to salawat. Madih is praising the Prophet ﷺ. If they're in the same language that the salawat is kind of formed of, then yes. But not if they're lines of madih, no. Then they're also the rewarding, however. Love of the Messenger, Dr. Nuruddin. There you go, that book. Usman, that's it. Usman translated it, and it's a Heritage Press. So that's a wonderful work by Dr. Nuruddin. I haven't read the English though, so I don't know. But Usman is a very capable translator though. Reciting salawat, what mindset should one have? I.e., look, I'm not going to comment on that in that sense. Of course, the ulama mentioned the mindset is a deep love for the Prophet ﷺ, and every facet of love, a deep connection with him, as if you're seeing him, and all these things they mention. Of course, your mindset is probably better than mine, so I'm not going to comment on that. But of course, everybody knows what mindset generally you should have. Will you be doing another Fard Ain course? Afifa, mashallah, assalamu alaikum. I don't know what I'll be doing there. I mean, I'm dedicated still to my teaching in sacred text and all my students that I have, and they're my priority. And my family are my priority. So aside from anything external, and of course now I'm at Deen Central at the hub in Solihull. So if it's not connected to those three things, I can't promise anything, but inshallah, if it's within that, then maybe. Our Master Muhammad by Sheikh Abdul Sirajuddin, an excellent work in English, published by Sunni Publications based in the Netherlands. Excellent work here. Can you tell us a story behind the Dala'il Khairat? No, I can't, in the sense that I don't know it. I know there's that story of the little girl, spitting in the well, but I've heard that's apocryphal, so my knowledge of the Khairat stories is not that great, so I don't know if I can comment on it. What's the difference between Sayyiduna and Sayyidina? Nothing. They're just a different Arab, different inflection in the Arabic language. Yeah, but the word essentially means the same thing. Yeah, so anything else? I have heard reciting salawat after Friday Asr prayers forgives 8 years of sins. I don't know of that particular hadith. I could check it. See, I'm always a bit, when we have language in a hadith that states things like 80 years, we have to recheck those. A lot of those hadith, unfortunately, when mentioning years, etc., are often quite weak. I will check it, inshallah. I know there are hadith that are sahih about sending salawat on Fridays, but this particular narration, I'll have to check that. Is the word Rajab a dipto or a tripto? Yeah, Omar, is this a grammar class? If you're in any of our classes, then ask it there, inshallah. So yeah. Any other question? No problem. So if you have my number, just drop me a message. Anything else before we? In terms of last week's discourse, like I said, I'm going to be redoing a part of it. That's why I took it off next week and adding to it quite a bit, and hopefully be over 2 weeks. Inshallah ta'ala. On my phone. Many people struggle to take all the things from books about the character of the Prophet. How do we implement things when they are so much, especially if we are trying to embody them? Yeah, it's absolutely, you're 100% right. See, so many things I said. That's why I said to try to take practical things, the little things, but practical. Habul a'mali lillahi adwamuha wa in qalla, the hadith of the Prophet the most. Last week's discourse won't be uploaded unless I edit it and put it up. But I've got no intention of uploading currently. This one will, inshallah, be straight away beyond. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the most beloved acts to God are the small ones, consistent ones, even if they're small. So that's very important. So take little things that affect our character that we can do day to day and just put those into practice. That's what helps me anyway. That benefits me. That benefits me. So also, inshallah ta'ala, if everybody's okay with it, I hope to set up a group, like a WhatsApp group of some sort for the discourses, which will be forthcoming, inshallah. So if everybody's happy with it, Hamza, you'll run it, inshallah. And then updates and stuff and additions will be put onto there. For now, keep your eye open on the website. Or rather, let me put it different, because I want to collect people's emails, inshallah. Yeah, on the discourses page, I'm going to put something up, and then inshallah updates will go on the discourses page, so I can start adding people, and a lot of updates. And I've got a lot of plans for the discourses. Other people will be invited. We could take questions in more structured format. We can have a few more lives that are generally Q&As and things of that nature. So inshallah, that will be happening very, very soon. And then we can interact in a much more fluid way with all the viewers as well for this, inshallah ta'ala. I'll stop there for today if there are no more questions. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم وأتوب إليه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.